We're now going to consider Aristotle's thoughts about justice. We are going to put aside for the time being um, his ideas, his theories, his account of what happiness is and of what the human good is. We covered that from book one. We looked a little bit into book two to get a list of the virtues. We're going to put that material to the side for the time being and shift our attention to justice. Now, that material is going to come back because one of the things that we're going to see is that Aristotle's thoughts about justice, his ideas about justice, involve this notion of happiness, of the highest good. But to understand how exactly happiness and justice are related, we need to go through book five of the Nicomachean Ethics a bit, go through his ideas about justice, and then we'll be in position to kind of bring back that material about happiness and see how justice and happiness relate to one another. But for the time being, we'll put this stuff about happiness, put it to the side, put it on the back burner. I don't know, is that something people say? And let's focus on justice. Okay. We already know a little bit, at least from book 2, chapter 7 in the Nicomachean Ethics, what exactly Aristotle is going to say about justice. He's going to claim that it's a virtue, that it's a state of character. And so because that's what he says in book 2, chapter 7. Book 2, chapter 7, if you recall, contains a list of virtues. So he lists courage and temperance and liberality or generosity, whatever you want to call it. Justice is one of those virtues that he lists. And so Aristotle's kind of primary understanding of justice is that it's a state of character. It's not primarily something that describes institutions, social institutions or political institutions. It is primarily what a person is like. It's a state of character. This is going to contrast with some later thinkers, we think, in particular, with some later thinkers we're going to read, in particular, a guy named John Rawls. State of character, that's what Aristotle wants to say. Well, what kind of state of character? Well, that gets a little harder to say. That's where Aristotle is going to start he's going to start elucidating how exactly he sees justice. And what he sees as kind of central to justice is the idea that it's our character. Sure, it's a state of character, but as it relates to others, it's a kind of other regarding virtue. It's our character, but not just considered in its own right. It's our character and how it affects or relates to other people. And so Aristotle draws a contrast in these first few chapters of book 5 between the virtues proper, things like courage and temperance and so on, and then justice. The virtues like courage and temperance consider your character kind of in its own right, what your disposition is, how you're motivated, and so on. Whereas justice considers your character as it affects other people and as it affects the community more generally. Something like that is his first attempt to clarify what justice is. He's going to get more specific because he thinks that there are different kinds of justice, that we use justice in different senses. In book 5, chapter 1, he says justice is ambiguous. And what he means by that is that though we don't realize it, there are different kinds or senses of justice. And the main division that he's going to draw is between what he calls particular justice and then this other kind of justice that he doesn't give a name to. But people who read Aristotle, commentators on Aristotle, give it the name general justice to contrast it with particular justice, right? So general versus particular. He calls the one particular justice. He doesn't give a name to the other, but for ease of reference, we'll call it general justice. And so we get this distinction between what he calls general justice and particular justice. And the way he arrives at this distinction is by looking at how we talk about justice and who we call just. And his idea is that, well, sometimes we see someone who's acting kind of unlawfully, right? And we want to say, oh, that person's being unjust. They're acting unlawfully. Well, that's a sign, according to Aristotle, that the lawful is one kind of justice. And he identifies that as this general kind of justice. On the other hand, sometimes we're a little bit more specific. Saying someone's being unlawful, that's very general. There's any number of different kinds of behaviors that could qualify as unlawful. But sometimes we're a little bit more specific in how we use the word just or unjust. Sometimes we pick out people who are being kind of unfair. So not just unlawful, but unfair, which is a more specific complaint. Or another way Aristotle puts it, unequal. But what exactly equal means in this context needs a lot of unpacking, and we'll talk about that in due course. Right? So sometimes we say people are being unfair and they're being unjust in that sense. Well, that's different than being unlawful. How exactly it's different, again, we're going to talk about in due course. All of these different kinds of justice, I'm going to kind of give you the general overview, and then we're going to go through them in detail one by one. So we get this first distinction between general justice, which is kind of being lawful, whatever that means, we'll talk about it, and particular justice, which is a matter of being fair or equal, whatever those things mean. He then subdivides particular justice. There are two kinds of particular justice. He calls them distributive justice and rectificatory justice. We'll talk about these in more detail in due course, but first kind of take on them. Distributive justice, well, that's you maybe even have heard that phrase before. It has to do with how things are distributed, right? And then this idea, I gather, is going to make some kind of intuitive sense, right? Goods might be distributed unjustly, unfairly, unequally, right? That's a kind, or by contrast, they might be distributed fairly, right? The distributions of goods among the members of a community can be either just or unjust. That's a kind of justice, distributive justice. We'll talk about it in more detail later. Rectificatory justice, right? That's a hard word to say and type. Rectify, make right, right? That's where the word is coming from. That's what rectify means. You rectify a wrong, you make it right. And that's kind of what he has. That's kind of the main idea. There's this, you make something right. If there's some inequality, you make it right. And in particular, what he has in mind here, as we'll see, is exchange, right? So if we exchange goods, you give me something, I have to give you something in return. I have to make it right. That's one thing he has in mind. The other thing he has in mind is, primary thing he has in mind is punishment. If I've done something wrong, if I've broken the law in some way, or done something, harmed somebody, stolen something, I have to make that right. And I make that right in part by being punished. Perhaps also by paying a fine, by giving back what I stole, whatever, things like that. That's all going to fall under this heading of rectificatory justice. And so what we're going to do now, or next, is turn to each kind of justice in detail.